All right. Inshallah, we're going to go ahead and start. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ونبينا أبي القاسم المصطفى محمد وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين واللعنة الدائمة على أعدائهم أجمعين من الآن إلى قيام يوم الدين. For the love of our beloved Prophet and his beloved progeny, please recite a loud salawat. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعجل فرجهم. So, inshallah, as we normally do, let's take a moment to recite Surah Fatiha for the marhumin and marhumat of everybody, especially the marhumin and marhumat of the sponsors of tonight's program, Dr. Salman and Sister Sukaina and family, and Brother Nadim Naqvi and Dr. Batul Imtiaz and family. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen ar-Rahman ar-Rahim Maliki yawmiddin Iyyaka na'budu wa iyyaka nasta'in ihdinas siratal mustaqim siratal ladzina an'amta 'alayhim ghayril maghdubi 'alayhim waladdallin. All right, as we normally do, I will go through the dua of today as the brothers and sisters will be logging on, and then inshallah we'll go through a review of what we discussed yesterday. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Allahumma la tu'akhidhni fihi bil-'atharat. Ya Allah, on a day like this, do not hold me accountable for those mistakes that I make in this day. وَأَقِلْنِي فِيهِ مِنَ الْخَطَايَا وَالْحَفَوَاتِ. And if I do end up making a mistake, then you forgive me. You allow me to take back that mistake. وَلَا تَجْعَلْنِي فِيهِ غَرَضًا لِلْبَلَايَا وَالْآفَاتِ. And on a day like this, do not give me exposure. Do not make me a point of exposure. لِلْبَلَايَا, for the trials and tribulations, وَالْآفَاتِ, and the plagues, the things that ruin someone's life. بِعِزَّتِكَ يَا عِزَّ الْمُسْلِمِينَ. By the right of your might, O the one who is the might of the Muslimin, the one who brings might and power to the Muslimin, inshaAllah. So, to review quickly what we had been discussing yesterday, we were talking about the story of Yusuf alayhi salam, and essentially we reached this point in the story where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala explained how this wife of Potiphar, the wife of this high-ranking official in the empire, essentially made her advance towards Yusuf alayhi salam. And Yusuf was the type of person who said no to this. We went through the verse of the Quran. This was verse 24 of Surah Yusuf, in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was explaining that the wife of Potiphar, وَلَقَدْ هَمَّتْ بِهِ, she wanted to go ahead with this, وَهَمَّ بِهَا لَوْلَا أَن رَأَى بُرْهَانَ رَبِّهِ. And Yusuf would have come close to going ahead with this if it was not for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala showing him his burhan. And we said that this burhan refers to the infallibility of Yusuf alayhi salam, in that special knowledge that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grants to the prophets of his, that in difficult moments like these, it comes to save them, it comes to help them. But the helping and the saving, and this was the critical point that we discussed yesterday, the helping and the saving is not the type of helping and saving that if it's not there, this person will end up committing this deed. That's not the type of helping that's happening. The type of helping that's happening is the type where it doesn't even allow this person to consider this sin. This is the type of helping and saving that's happening because of the special knowledge that that individual has, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has granted to him. That was key and that was important in understanding the story of Yusuf alayhi salam. Why? Because if you look at the story of Yusuf and you understand this verse of the Quran to mean that Yusuf was going to go ahead with it and that at the last moment we saved him, as some of these ahadith, and we know that they are false, happen to imply and suggest, then Yusuf is not so much of a prophet anymore. He's not so much of a pure person anymore. And we said the verses of the Quran themselves, they show us that Yusuf would not be the type of person who would ever do such a thing, because the verse of the Quran, first of all, it says كَذَلِكَ لِنَصْرِفَ عَنْهُ السُّوءَ وَالْفَحْشَاءَ, because this is how this is how we got evil to turn away from Yusuf. Instead of saying we got Yusuf to turn away from the evil, That's first of all, that means Yusuf never even made that decision. And second of all, the end of that verse, the end of verse 24 says, إِنَّهُ مِنْ عِبَادِنَا الْمُخْلَصِينَ. He was one of those pure servants of ours. And when someone is referred to as a pure servant, that means that the idea of committing a sin is not even something that this person considers. Yes, it might come to their mind. Yes, shaitan might try to tempt them to do this. But once they think about it for a second, they will not even consider it, to ponder about it. Should I do this? Should I not do this? This is not how a prophet goes about things. Especially a prophet that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala refers to as ibadina al-mukhlasin. Those servants of ours that were close servants. They were purified servants of ours. And we said that shaitan, in that initial conversation that he had with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he also referred to this idea. He also said that out of all of your servants, I will make sure to misguide all of them, except for إِلَّا عِبَادَكَ مِنْهُمُ الْمُخْلَصِينَ, except for those servants of yours that are mukhlasin, they are purified by you. Them I cannot touch, I cannot approach them. This is also why you find in the verses of the Quran that whenever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells the Prophet to seek refuge in him, he does not tell him that when shaitan comes and tricks you, then you come and you seek refuge in me. He says, وَإِذَا مَسَّهُمْ طَائِفٌ مِّنَ الشَّيْطَانِ, for the mu'mineen, when shaitan comes and surrounds the mu'mineen. But when it comes to the Prophet, he says, when shaitan comes and pokes you from far away. In other words, shaitan cannot even approach this individual because this individual is so pure that it doesn't make any sense for shaitan to approach him at this point. Yes, shaitan can still put thoughts in his mind. Shaitan can still try to tempt him. That is possible. But because this person has been purified, when that thought comes into his mind, he does not consider it in the sense of, should I do this, should I not do this? It's not even a moment of thought necessarily for him. He knows for a fact that he's not going to go ahead with it. So these two clues in the verse tell us that Yusuf would have never gone ahead with this. And if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has shown him this burhan, has shown him this sign that comes from him being a prophet, this is for him to not even consider it, not to stop him from actually committing the deed. Okay, so that's what we discussed. And then we carried on. We said that is essentially Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because he put Yusuf through this test, therefore there is no excuse for someone like you and me. And those who come on the day of judgment and they want to essentially come up with excuses, they want to tell Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that the reason why they ended up committing sins with the opposite gender, it was because they had the good looks, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will bring out, if it is a man, that he will bring out Yusuf alayhi salam. And he will point to people on the day of judgment and say, I also gave these good looks to Yusuf, and my Yusuf, he didn't end up committing these sins. So what excuse do you have? And if it's a lady, then he will bring out Lady Maryam salamullahi alayha, and he will say the same thing, that I gave this beauty to Maryam salamullahi alayha, but she didn't end up committing these sins that you're talking about. Therefore, there is no excuse for any of us. Then we ended up with this part of the verse where Yusuf, now that he rejected the suggestion of Zulaykha, he didn't just stand there, he started to run because he knew that was the only option he had. وَاسْتَبَقَ الْبَابِ وَقَدَّتْ قَمِيصَهُ مِنْ دُبُرٍ. As he was running away, Zulaykha caught onto his clothes from the back of his clothes and tore it from the back of his clothes until وَأَلْفَيَ سَيِّدَهَا لَدَى الْبَابِ. All of a sudden, they saw Potiphar has opened the door and is standing at the door. And this is roughly where we ended essentially last time. وَأَلْفَيَ سَيِّدَهَا لَدَى الْبَابِ. And then of course Zulaykha went a step further to say that, look, Yusuf was here to, inappropriately make advance towards me, right? When you're not around, he was trying to get at me while you weren't around. Okay, this is where we ended yesterday. I want to take a moment to delve a little bit deeper and to elaborate on this topic a little bit. When we look at the story of Yusuf, this moment, of course, is a very heroic moment. This moment where you have Zulaykha standing in front of you and everything is prepared for you to engage in the sin, but still you end up not engaging in the sin. This is something that really shows the ultimate faith of a person. And that's why we called it an ultimate showdown, because it truly was an ultimate showdown to see whether the love of Yusuf, the love that Yusuf has for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will be enough to pull Yusuf towards him. And that's what happened. However, here's a point that I want to talk about to take this story and apply it to our lives a little bit more, brothers and sisters. And in this is a lesson for the younger people and for the elders, right? Essentially, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not expecting us to be like Yusuf. This might sound a little bit like a contradiction, what I'm saying. It might sound a little ironic, a little weird, a little odd, what I'm saying. But just bear with me, because there's an important point that we want to learn from this part of the story of Yusuf. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not expect us to be like Yusuf. Yes, He expects us to stay away from haram. But does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala think that if we were in a position like the position of Yusuf, that we would be able to run away from a haram that is right there in front of us, that is standing right there in front of us? The answer is no. We know that we would not be like that. And the proof for that is because there are sins that are not standing in front of us and still we engage in them. And therefore Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows that our level of faith, right, is going to be a lot less than the Yusufs of the world. In Islam, because of this point, in Islam, you don't find emphasis so much of putting yourself in this position and then trying to get yourself out of it. No. What you find emphasis on is a human being trying to avoid the situation to begin with. Okay? Bear with me, because this is a very practical point. And if someone walks away from this story thinking that they're going to be Yusuf, and when they come across Zulaykha and they're right in front of Zulaykha, then they're going to run away, then they have to think again, really. Because that's not what's going to happen 99% of the time. In Islam, we are taught and we are emphasized to do what? To make sure that we do not place ourselves in that situation to begin with. We are emphasized to not spend time with the Zuleykhas of the world, man or woman, to then have it reach a point that what happens, Zulaykha is standing in front of me and everything is prepared, and then I want to say no to it, because more often than not, someone like me and someone like you, we will not say no to that, right? Because our faith is nowhere near the faith that Yusuf alayhi salam had. What we are taught in Islam is to keep your distance before it even reaches that point. In Islam, we're taught that when you're speaking to the opposite gender, when you're interacting with the opposite gender, that you don't feel so comfortable, that you set some boundaries ahead of time, that you set some barriers between you and the opposite gender ahead of time, so that it never even reaches this point. Why? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows that if it were to reach that point, our faith is weak. It's interesting, when studies have been done on people who have willpower, people who are able to stick with, they're very disciplined, they're able to stick with the decisions that they make. The studies show that these are not people necessarily who have greater willpower. They are people who have planned their life in such a way where they place themselves in situations where they are tempted less compared to the other group that places itself in situations where they are tempted more. This is what Islam wants us to do. Islam wants us to be able to read this situation and understand and not be naive, and to separate ourselves from the opposite gender before things get to this point. Because if things get to this point, it's not necessarily going to go well. Yes, Yusuf is 1 in a million. Yusuf is a prophet. Yusuf is one that thousands of years later we're going to sit and read his story, because he was able to move away from the sin at that last moment. But for us, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not even want it to get to that point. Now you might say, well, Shaykh, if Yusuf was supposed to do this, if this is what Islam wants from us, to stay away from sin, not even allow it to get to that point, well then what was Yusuf doing then? Wasn't Yusuf supposed to do the same thing? That's a very good question. Yusuf had nowhere to go. That's the whole point. Yusuf was a servant. Yusuf, he had no shelter. He had no refuge. It's not like Yusuf had another place to go, and that he decided not to go and just rely on his faith that he would not engage in haram with Zulaykha. No. Yusuf had no other place to go. In fact, he was a servant. If he were to leave, essentially he might have been killed even, because they had laws back in the day, and even during the time of the Prophet they had such laws, that if a servant were to run away and then he would come back, there was severe punishment. And of course, the Prophet changed the way people used to deal with their servants during that time, right? But before the Prophet was there was severe punishments if a servant were to run away and then come back. When they caught him and then he came back, there were severe punishments for him. So Yusuf alayhi salam, if you find him alone in a room with Zulaykha, it's not because he doesn't care. It's not because he relies on his faith to hold him at that last moment. It's because he has nowhere else to go. It's because he's a servant. It's because someone owns him. That's why. Otherwise, do you think if Yusuf was not in this position where he is owned by another person, do you think he would just sit around if there is a sister or a lady or a woman making these advancements towards him? No, he would have changed the situation. He would have left that house altogether. This is very important. Now, in the culture that we live in and in the society that we live in, I am constantly surprised, of course, to see that there is this special type of naiveness that you find amongst people, especially in this culture and in this society. And the world is really moving in this direction as a whole, whether you live in the West or you don't live in the West. You know, live in the West or you live in the East, you're watching this from America or wherever else in the world you might be watching. There is this naiveness in the Western culture when it comes to this issue, that they allow the man and the woman to interact with one another, to mix and mingle with one another. All of the tools of taking pleasure of this interaction and this mixing is placed at the disposal of man and woman. And then when this man or woman end up engaging in the type of deed that is considered immoral, whether Islamically speaking or even socially speaking immoral, as in the case of two people who are married, for example, when this happens, then they act naive. They act as if they couldn't even tell this was coming. I don't know if you're following my point, brothers and sisters. When you understand and you know the nature of man and woman, you know the nature of the human being, and then you place this human beings, this man and this woman, so close to one another that they're laughing together, they're giggling away together, they're sharing their, the different parts of their life with one another, they're mixing and mingling every single second. And then when they do end up engaging with one another on a physical level, then, or even on an emotional level, then you act surprised. Why are you acting surprised? Why is it that you think and you act naive as if you were to not know that if you put these two beside one another, that essentially they're going to catch fire? It's like having matches, right, around gas. And then if something were to happen, you act naive and you say, oh, I don't know what happened. I don't know what could possibly have, gone wrong. Well, you knew that these two were going to flammable. They were going to catch fire together. You put these two close to one another. Only thing you're asking for is a disaster, right? And when I say a disaster, by the way, I'm going even beyond what we would consider Islamically a disaster, even from a moral perspective. As in the case of people who are married, for example. Forget about people who are not married for a second. People who are married, when this does happen, then they act surprised. Oh, I didn't think I would get engaged with this person, on a physical evil or even on an emotional level, because a lot of times this stuff starts with an emotional aspect to this. And I'm saying this for the younger people out there, that initially when these types of relationships start, they start out with an emotional feeling to them, an emotional aspect to them. Then later on it might turn into something else, God forbid. You can't act surprised. No. If a brother or sister, man and woman, male and female, if they are in close contact with one another and they don't set any boundaries between them, then they are only asking for a disaster. We cannot be naive the way the culture here is naive, that they place man and woman in such close proximity of one another, and then when something goes wrong, all of a sudden everyone acts as if they didn't expect this to come. Right? A married man doesn't expect to engage with another woman. Well, of course this is going to happen if there is so much interaction and so much mixing. We can't be naive like that. Our religion has not allowed us to be naive like that. In Islam, a man and a woman, the moment they go in the same room, if there's a chance this will lead to haram, then what is this? Them being in that room is haram. What is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala telling you and me? He's telling you and me that you're not Yusuf. Don't think you're Yusuf. No, you have to cut off this relationship way before it actually gets to that point where you're sitting alone with that individual. Right? This is how Islam approaches this issue. As much as, this is the other point I want to make before we continue with the verses, as much as Islam has also taught us not to be naive when it comes to our interactions and to keep our distance and to keep our boundaries and place barriers between the two genders, at the same time, we also, brothers and sisters, as parents, I will say this, and as a community, We cannot be naive as to what type of world and what type of time our children are growing up in. Our children are growing up in a time and in an age where this access is beyond anything their fathers could even ever imagine. The world is changing rapidly. The world is not even what it was 10 years ago. I can tell you that for a fact. The world has changed dramatically from 10 years ago, let alone 50 years ago. Our parents and our communities, they can't be naive and assume that their child is going to be Yusuf alayhi salam. No, you have to help your child set the foundation so that your child has some tools with him, so that when he is in that situation, because he will definitely be in that situation living in the society, that he knows how to go about it. And making this idea and this concept of marriage simpler in our communities and making it easier in our communities is one of the steps. It's not going to be the ultimate solution. One of the steps that will essentially help with this. How many times do I hear, brothers and sisters, that when someone was suggested as a prospect to another individual, the mother or the father came up with the most ridiculous excuses you've ever heard to not even look into this. And now this brother or this sister, this young man or this young woman, not married yet, what do you think is going to happen? Why do we act naive? Why do we act as if our children are going to be the very peak of faith and iman? Were we the peak of faith and iman? Of course we weren't. Nobody is. We can't be naive and assume that our children are going to be tested in these different ways. They're living in a world where every time they bat an eye, right, something haram is presented to them. And then we assume that, no, inshallah, nothing is going to happen. No, we have to set the foundation. And making this concept of marriage a little bit easier in our communities is one of the major steps. Another one of them is teaching our children how to set boundaries with the opposite gender. Another one of them is showing them how, in reality and in practice, they are to set barriers with the opposite gender. And there are other steps that we need to take as well. But we at least cannot be naive about this. The reality is that the tests and tribulations are going to be there. We have to use the tools that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has put at our disposal as parents to help our children. And if we are naive and we just assume that, no, my child is going to be fine, I'm afraid we are asking for a disaster. I'm afraid we're asking for a situation where later on we find out about things that then we cannot do anything about, and the only thing that we can do at that point is regret the situation. I pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that we don't come to that. But in order to make sure we don't, we have to take some real steps, some practical steps. And when it comes to marriage, that is one of the practical steps. Of course, our children have to grow up. Of course, they have to have the level of maturity that is necessary for them to be able to embark on this journey of marriage. But then I see people, unfortunately, they have that maturity in their child, and still there are barriers, and still there are other non-issues that are turning into issues and deal breakers when it comes to having their child move on with their life. And I pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that inshallah as a community we can take some steps to enable our children to embark on this journey if they're prepared for it, inshallah. Okay, having said that, let's go back to the story. And in this story we reach this point that Yusuf alayhi salam came to the door and they found Potiphar at the door. When they found Potiphar at the door, Zulaykha, being the very smart person that she was, Zulaykha was extremely sophisticated in her thinking. She said this one line. She went on the offense and she brought up the idea that Yusuf was attacking her. But the way that she did this was very, very clever. Okay? Clever in a negative way, of course, but still, she was doing it in a sophisticated manner. And what she did was this. When Potiphar came to the door, Zulaykha did not even mention the idea that Yusuf has come to attack me and therefore we need to punish him. If you pay attention in the verses, she skipped over that part and she went straight to this. She asked Potiphar, let me ask you, Potiphar, if someone were to attack your wife, what is the punishment for it? What does that mean? That means the idea that Yusuf has been there to attack me is already done. That's already a done deal. This was the plotting of Zulaykha. This was the sophistication of Zulaykha. This is how sophisticated Zulaykha was when she was dealing especially with her husband. She knew how to go about things in such a way to get her goals fulfilled. And of course these goals and these plans of course were negative. But at the end of the day, that's how she was. She didn't even sit there and say, well, let's discuss, let me prove to you that Yusuf was there to attack me. That's not what she did. When Potiphar came, she automatically said what? قالت ما جزاء من أراد بأهلك سوءا. She said, what is the punishment of the one who attacks your wife? In other words, the fact that Yusuf has been attacking your wife and making such advancements towards your wife, this is already a done deal. That's done. That's, taken for granted. That's completely done with. Now let's discuss what the punishment is. Are we gonna put him in prison, or are we gonna bother him and torture him some other way? That's what we have to discuss. Otherwise, him wanting to attack me, that's completely understood at this point from the viewpoint of Zulaykha. Okay, having said this, Yusuf alayhi salam comes back and he responds. But it's beautiful that he responds with a very simple line. Usually when someone were to come and accuse somebody, the person who has been accused, in defense of himself, he will then sit there and start to swear, for example. Or at least even if he's not swearing, he will emphasize. If someone comes and says, you were about to do this, and the person who has been accused, he will say, no, why would I ever do such a thing? By God, I would never do such a thing. Surely I never did such a thing. But Yusuf alayhi salam responded with a very simple answer. And that was pretty much because he knew that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was going to take care of this situation for him. قَالَ هِيَ رَاوَدَتْنِي عَنْ نَفْسِي. He said, you know what? No, she has been making advancements towards me. Initially, Yusuf was quiet. He didn't say anything. Who started this conversation? Zulaykha started this conversation. Because Yusuf had manners. In terms of the manners that he had in the presence of Potiphar, he didn't want to start this discussion and this conversation. But when Potiphar saw his wife started, then Yusuf had to defend himself. This was the adab that Yusuf was showing. But when she started, then he added, قَالَ هِيَ رَاوَدَتْنِي عَنْ نَفْسِي. And then the verses of the Quran speak of this specific incident that took place, that there is someone who comes and saves the day for Yusuf. وَشَهِدَ شَاهِدٌ مِّنْ أَهْلِهَا إِنْ كَانَ قَمِيصُهُ قُدَّ مِنْ دُبُرٍ مِّنْ قُبُلٍ فَصَدَقَتْ وَهُوَ مِنَ الْكَاذِبِينَ وَإِنْ كَانَ قَمِيصُهُ قُدَّ مِنْ دُبُرٍ فَكَذَبَتْ وَهُوَ مِنَ الصَّادِقِينَ. Okay, this person or this thing, whatever it was, this shahid, as the verses of the Quran says, came into the picture and told Potiphar, listen, if you want to know what really happened here, you have to look at the clothes of Yusuf. Are the clothes of Yusuf torn apart from the front? Or are they torn apart from the back? Because if they're torn apart from the back, that means he's telling the truth because he was running away. But if they're torn apart from the front, then that means Zulaykha was trying to get him away from herself. And therefore what she is saying is the truth. Okay, so the Quran says that there was some sort of shahid here. There's some sort of person. But who was this shahid? Who was this individual? Mufassirin have different opinions about this. Some say it was an older man who was very wise. Some say other things. One of the opinions that some of the Mufassirin have gone ahead with was that there was a child or an infant in the household of Potiphar. And when this happened, Yusuf alayhi salam turned to the child and to the infant and said, you should ask this infant what happened here. Okay? Now, of course, an infant cannot speak. That's why the hadith says that when Potiphar looked at the infant and looked at Yusuf, he was very surprised. He said, you're expecting me to look at an infant and an infant tells me what to do? And then the hadith says that this infant started to speak all of a sudden. And this infant put out this principle to Potiphar that, listen, if it's torn from the back, then this is what happened. And if it's torn from the front, then this is what happens. Okay. Now, this hadith, of course, is not too much of a strong hadith. I do have to mention that. The chain of narrators of this hadith is not very strong. But then again, it is a hadith that we have out there. And that's why some of the scholars have gone ahead with it. And of course, Allama Tabatabai has another clue in the verse to go ahead with this meaning as well. So the hadith says that no one speaks when they are a child except for 3 or 4 individuals. One of them is this person that the Quran is referring to, this infant that was there in the story of Yusuf. Another, of course, is Isa alayhi salam when he was in the cradle. And Maryam فَأَشَارَتْ إِلَيْهِ, Maryam pointed towards him. قالوا كيف نكلم من كان في المهد صبيا. They said, how are we going to speak to a child? قال إني عبد الله. Then Isa alayhi salam, he started to speak all of a sudden. This is the tafsir that most of the mufassirin have gone ahead with, and this is what we will stick to, inshallah. Then the verses of the Quran continue that وَإِن كان فَلَمَّا رَأَى قَمِيصَهُ قُدَّ مِن دُبُرٍ. Potiphar looked at this situation and, well, he said, well, I can see the clothes of Yusuf, they're torn from the back. He said two things. قَالَ إِنَّهُ مِنْ كَيْدَكُنْ. He said, you know what? This is from the plotting of you women. Now, of course, this isn't referring to all women. It's referring to these women who were doing this in the negative way, and in particular Zulaykha. قَالَ إِنَّهُ مِنْ كَيْدَكُنْ إِنَّ كَيْدَكُنَّ عَظِيمٌ. Your plotting is very severe. Okay. What is Potiphar talking about here? Of course, he knows his wife. He knows how sophisticated his wife is when it comes to planning things, and of course, in her case, in a negative way, plotting things. But this, of course, is a principle that we know even from other, essentially, teachings within Islam, that the female in Islam, from the Islamic perspective, has been given a sophisticated thought process that the male has not been given. And this, I will say, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has blessed the female with this. The reason why I say that is because a lot of times the female can take this and use it to her benefit, to the benefit of her family, to the benefit of the people around her. Sometimes the female, because she is sophisticated in the way she thinks in such a way that the male is not, therefore she can use this to change the fate of the life of, for example, family members, their husband, their child, whatever the case may be. Sometimes there's one sentence, and the brothers who are watching this know very well what I'm saying. The one sentence that a female, a sister might say in the household that can carry so much more meaning and weight compared to the 10 sentences that a male will say. Because it's done in such a sophisticated manner, right? And hopefully it's done in a good manner as well, that it carries so much value. And this is something Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has blessed the female with. Don't look at Zulaykha in particular here. Zulaykha, of course, she used this ability, she used this talent and this gift of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in a negative way. But it's not just Zulaykha though, right? Other women can use this in a wonderful way. One of the best examples of how a female has been able to use this gift that they had, this sophisticated thought process, right? This attention to detail, to then change the fate of their husband, is the wife of Zuhair ibn Qayna in the station before coming to Karbala. These stations that Abu Abdullah had before coming to the actual land and plains of Karbala, we read in history that Zuhair ibn Qayn was there, and that the grandson of the Prophet, Abu Abdullah, sent a message to Zuhair ibn Qayn. And initially Zuhair ibn Qayn was not going to accept. But then his wife looked at this situation from a certain angle, because she is blessed with this sophisticated way of thinking and this detailed way of thinking. And she approached him with this angle that, Ya Zuhair, the son of Fatima is asking you to go and speak to her, to him. You're not going to respond to this? And what happened? Then all of a sudden Zuhair went, and he essentially never came back. He left his soul with Abu Abdullah, as we read. So this is a talent and a gift that the female has been gifted with, and you will find many times in history, sometimes, as in the case of Zulaykha, it is used in a negative manner, and a lot of times it might be used in a positive manner. It just depends on who it is and how they are going to go about things. Okay. Moving on, this is the first thing that Potiphar said, that inna kaydakunna adim. Second thing that he said, he turned to Yusuf, Yusuf, a'rid an hada. Turn away from this issue. Forget about this issue. Don't speak of this issue to anybody. Now, brothers and sisters, as we continue with the story, there is a very critical point and lesson here, because Yusuf never talked about this story. Remember that and hold on to that, because a couple of verses later we're going to talk about this issue of speaking of things that happen here and there. The idea of chit-chatting here and there. We're going to get to that in just a second. Potiphar asked Yusuf to not speak of this. Did Yusuf ever speak of this? Yusuf never spoke of this. Even though he was the victim, he never spoke of this. Okay, moving on from this. The last thing that Potiphar added was "Staghfiri li dhanbik." You know, Zulaykha, you made a mistake. You are to repent. Innaki kunti minal khati'in. You are amongst those who have made a mistake. Okay. Here is the part where the story takes a twist. All right. And inshallah, I'll just get the grounds ready, inshallah, and then we'll continue tomorrow. This is the part where the story takes a little bit of a twist to it. وَقَالَ نِسْوَةٌ فِي الْمَدِينَةِ امْرَأَةُ الْعَزِيزِ تُرَاوِدُ فَتَاهَا. All of a sudden, after this incident was over, and everything had ended in the palace of Potiphar, and Potiphar essentially had put out this fire that he turned to Zulaykha and told Zulaykha, Zulaykha, you don't tell anybody about this and you keep quiet about it and you repent. You made this mistake. And then he turned to Yusuf. He said, Yusuf, a'rid an hada. You don't make the mistake of speaking to anybody about this either. Then all of a sudden, what started happening? The women in the city started to speak to one another. They started to chit-chat with one another. They started to turn towards one another in their small little gatherings here and there. And they started to say what? Imra'atul Aziz, the wife of Aziz, the one who is supposed to be living the most luxurious life. Let me tell you something about her. Turawidu fataha. She wanted to approach her servants. Okay, let me ask you this, brothers and sisters. Which one of these is worse? When we look at the story of Yusuf, we look at the worst deed that took place in the story of Yusuf being what? The advancement of Zulaykha. This suggestion that Zulaykha was trying to make in this situation to Yusuf, and Yusuf, of course, rejected. That's the worst deed that we think about in the story of Yusuf alayhi salam. Is that correct? That's not correct. That's the first that comes to our mind. But in reality, which of these two deeds was worse? What Zulaykha did in the hidden corners of the palace of Potiphar, or the idea that the women of the city then took this secret and started to chit-chat about it? Which one of these is worse? We look at the story of Yusuf and we say Zulaykha was such a terrible person for making all these plans. Her deed was such a wrong deed for making all her plans. And this deed was a wrong deed. And what she did with planning and all of that was completely wrong. But is this worse, or what the women of the city did, that they took this secret in the house of Zulaykha and then they started to publicize it? This should ring a bell for us, brothers and sisters. In Islam, what hadith do we have that speaks about the negative side of backbiting? What hadith do we have that speaks about how horrible backbiting is? Right? Isn't there hadith that says al-ghaybatu ashaddu min az-zina? What was Zulaykha trying to doing? She was trying to make this, suggestion to Yusuf and go ahead with this na'udhu billah, this terrible deed. But then these women in the city, they did something even worse. They sat there, they chit-chatted about Zulaykha. They were backbiting about Zulaykha. Without knowing it, they did something 10 times worse than what Zulaykha did. And there is a lesson for us in this as well. Because sometimes you might hear left or right from friends, from people you might know in the community, otherwise, of someone who must have done something wrong. If that person has done something wrong, then what do? You keep that in your pocket, and when you're sitting in a gathering with others, then you start sharing this idea with others. But what you don't realize, and what I don't realize, is that when you're sharing that secret with others, you just did something 10 times worse than what that person had done. We look at the story of Yusuf, and we say Zulaykha did such a terrible thing. And she did. But even more so than Zulaykha, we are supposed to sit there and say what? The women in the city of Egypt, what a horrible thing that they did. Because what they did, from an Islamic perspective, it carries more negative weights compared to what Zulaykha did. Doing this in the corners of her palace, it was wrong. Not to approve of it, disapprove, it was wrong. But what was even worse was the women of Egypt then taking this and sharing this everywhere. That yes, the wife of Potiphar, let me tell you something that will ruin her reputation. And we do the same, unfortunately, sometimes. Sometimes when we're sharing this secret with one another, in fact, what we end up doing is that we don't even have any negative thoughts about that person. It's just something we've heard and we share with others. Have you heard that this person did such and such? This is a problem. Now, there are seldom situations, there are very rare situations where sharing an information, a secret like this, is necessary. I know two people are getting married. I know this person is this type of a person and they have not changed their ways. They're still living this type of a life. Okay, well then I have to share this information with whoever the other prospect is. But very rarely is that the situation we're dealing with. Most of the time, no. It's just a matter of us not having anything to say. So what do? We start sitting and talking about others. Imam Khomeini, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless his soul, he had a condition for whoever he let into the circle of friends of his. His condition was this, that he had made with his friends, that whoever of us is sitting there in the circle of friends of ours, we can talk about whatever we want. We can't talk about someone who's not there. Because once we start talking about someone who's not there, then all of a sudden we'll start going into the negative aspects of their life, and then we'll start sharing information about the secrets of their life, and then we are doing backbiting. And the bad thing about backbiting is that you just said a couple of words and you didn't even take the pleasure of committing that sin, and you did something 10 times worse than committing that sin. That's the problem with backbiting, right? You become khasra dunya wal akhirah. You didn't take the pleasure in this world of committing the sin, and then you ended up committing something that was 10 times worse than committing the sin. So these women then took this sin of Zulaykha and they did something 10 times worse without even noticing it. وَقَالَ نِسْوَةٌ فِي الْمَدِينَةِ. The women came in the city and they said, إِمْرَأَةُ الْعَزِيزِ تُرَاوِدُ فَتَاهَا. Now, there was another side of this conversation that these women were having in the city as well. The other side of it, the other aspect of it was this, that they were also putting down Zulaykha as well. They were also saying, look, Zulaykha fell for who? And this is the last point I'll make before we wrap up, inshallah. They were also making the point that, look, Zulaykha fell for her servants. Zulaykha has affection for her servants. There is also another lesson to be learned from this. Inshallah, we don't have time to go through it today. Tomorrow we'll delve into that. What were the women? First of all, why were they speaking of Zulaykha in this negative manner? Second of all, if they were, what is it that we can take away from how these women were speaking about Zulaykha? That, oh, look at her. She fell for her servant. Can you believe that? Can you believe that you would fall for your servant, for the beauty of your servant? قَدْ شَغَفَهُ حُبًّا. His love has really made its way into her heart. Look at Zulaykha. She fell for her servant. There's a point to be understood from the way these women were talking, which is also the way that sometimes we talk about others who end up failing a test, who end up failing in a situation. Inshallah, that we will delve into tomorrow a little bit more to understand better what we have to stay away from. When we do hear someone has failed a test, what is it that we have to stay away from doing? Inshallah, tomorrow we'll delve into that as well. Before I end, inshallah, let's take a moment again to recite Surah Fatiha for all of your marhumin and marhumat, especially the marhumin and marhumat of sponsors of tonight's program, Dr. Salman Susukaina and family, and Brother Nadeem Naqwi and Dr. Batul Imtiaz and family, with a salawat. Allahumma salli ala Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Maliki yawmiddin. Iyyaka na'budu wa iyyaka nasta'in. Ihdina as-siratal mustaqim. Siratal ladhina an'amta alayhim ghayril maghdubi alayhim wa lad-dallin.
سبحان الله والحمد لله ولا إله إلا الله والله أكبر. الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله أشهد أن عليا ولي الله أشهد أن عليا حجة الله. حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح حي على خير العمل حي على خير العمل. الله أكبر الله أكبر. لا إله إلا الله لا إله إلا الله.